Welcome to the NT podcast, Science in Theology, and I am Nemanja Jurišić, and today I have the pleasure of speaking once again with Dr. Robin Collins, a distinguished philosopher best known for his work on the fine-tuning argument. Dr. Collins, welcome. How are you?
Good.
I appreciate your time, and in our previous conversation, we explored why theism is more probable than atheism or naturalism, but that raises the next big question. If theism is true, then which theistic worldview is most likely true? With so many religions in the world, why should we think Christianity has the best case? So that's exactly what we will dive into today, making the case for the Christianity. If you're new here, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the podcast for more thoughtful conversations on science and faith. So, Dr. Collins, my first question is, what makes Christianity stand out among other world religions from philosophical or evidential perspective?
Okay, let me just preface it with, years ago, how I got into this is I was teaching just a Christian apologetics course, and there was a lot of things I didn't like about the standard approach. And one of them, they usually took a particular theological position, usually kind of a more conservative evangelical position, and then defended it against objections. But they never presented anything of what would make Christianity attractive to somebody. Why would you want to believe it to begin with? And then when they did offer like arguments, the typical evidential arguments would be like the argument from the apostolic witness to the resurrection. I mean, I found the argument problematic, as one ex-apologist put it. It would be like if somebody said, in Iran somewhere, they said there was a set of disciples and said there was one of the person, let's say a woman, was the claimed to be the incarnation of the Holy Spirit, and then was executed, and they claimed she rose from the dead. You would think you would have to have a tremendous amount of evidence for that. You would think that even as a Christian, you would think the probability of that was really low. And so there's this huge challenge of making the probability of such an event, that even once you believe in God, of God doing such a thing, at least reasonable. And then you also have the second problem, is that kind of apologetics is the early disciples of Christianity, and particularly after the apostolic period, like 100 AD or so, they didn't have that kind of evidence. It wasn't firsthand evidence anymore. So it seems like would make their belief irrational. They didn't have sufficient evidence for that kind of belief. They didn't have all the sophisticated kind of arguments. So there needed to be something, I think, that raises the prior probability of that this would happen. Let's say like Jesus of Nazareth was raised from the dead, and the claims of Christianity are, that basic claims are true. And that also, that made their Christianity attractive and their faith rational. So this all led me eventually to what eventually I called the greatest story argument. And then in the last 6 months when we published this, I teamed up with somebody else, Joshua Rasmussen at Baylor University, to actually write a paper on this that's published in a book with Oxford University Press. I haven't got clear on what the title of the book is yet, but it'll be published. So let me give the basic outlines of the argument. So that's the main argument that gives it a reasonable prior probability that makes the whole thing, I think, actually very likely to be true, that would happen somewhere in the world, this sort of Christian story. And that this whole claim of somebody being the incarnation of God. So let me go through what the basic idea is. So if we start with the New Testament, like the Pauline letters, the huge stress in the Pauline letters is that the ultimate goal of God for human beings, particularly those who become Christians, but I would extend it to everybody, is that God wants us to be united with God's self. So, and that's cashed out for Paul in terms of sharing the life of God. So Paul has many passages where he says, it's no longer I that live, like in Galatians, but Christ that lives in me, and yet I live. You get in Romans, the book of Romans, we are inheritors of God through Christ. You get other places. We have anybody, we've been united with Christ in his death, and therefore we'd be united with Christ in his resurrection. I mean, this theme is consistent not only with Paul in other areas of the New Testament. So that's God's ultimate goal. It's not just like going to a heavenly state somewhere. It's actually being united with the life of God. So I originally cashed that out in terms of the idea that God has given us the greatest possible gift, God's self, if we were inheriting God, and then inheriting that gift in the greatest possible way, being united with God. And that would mean, in at least the context of Paul, sharing in the life of God was a way of cashing that out. Now, once you cash it out that way, you also see a commonality with which I think is important, with major branches of all the theistic traditions in the world, and even some of the non-theistic traditions. The idea of that the ultimate goal, the ultimate good for human beings is being united with ultimate reality. So you even see that in the non-theistic ones, but especially in the theistic ones. So you have the mystical branches of Judaism, that's in there. You have in the mystical branches of Islam, that's with particularly Sufism, major branches of Sufism. It's unity with God is the ultimate goal. You have that in Hinduism. You have that in then even the non-theistic versions of later developments of Buddhism and Taoism. So it's a kind of common intuition about what would be the supreme good for human beings and what's the ultimate goal. Okay. So, and that does seem to be the supreme good. I mean, it's obvious if God is the greatest possible being, then being united with God would be the supreme good. So that's kind of the beginning of the argument. Then the next stage in the argument is what is required to be united with God and what would be the maximally efficacious way of being united with God. So to be united, if you cash it out in terms of sharing in the life of God. So the next stage is what would be involved in being united with God and sharing in the life of God. So the idea here is that God in God's self is infinite. It's infinite conscious personhood. Okay. And God has all power, omnipotent everywhere. God is very, very unlike human beings in that respect. So in God's self, we couldn't share in God's life. That's not going to be possible. God is just too radically ontologically different from us. And I think all the religious traditions, the developed versions, stress that. You can just go across the board, that God is radically different from human beings. And so in order for us to share in the life of God, that would mean God would have to take on human life. And in other words, God's life would have to take on a human life. Now, here's where you get into the incarnation. And there's various understandings of the incarnation. I think probably the one that you get the Council of Chalcedon, various councils, like there's Nicaea, and there was a kind of simple statement of it, Jesus was fully human and fully divine, but then what did that mean? And you probably the closest way of cashing that out to what was in the eventually kind of the standard formulation in the Council of Chalcedon was what philosophers have called the two minds view or the divided minds view. And the idea there is that God took into God's self human consciousness in Jesus. So it was like God took on, so God still remains God, but in God the Son, in the Trinity, God the Son took on this human consciousness and its limitations. So it's included that within the divine consciousness and then acted in Jesus. So the idea is Jesus being fully God. In this view, Jesus is, it's ultimately God acting, but God acts in accordance with the belief system and the dispositions within that human consciousness. So it's a little bit like, if you want to think of it, is like method acting, when you act. And a method actor tries to enter into the personality, the beliefs, and the conscious subjectivity of the person they're playing. And then on stage acts in accordance with that. So they spend a lot of time kind of reading about the person who they're playing, right? If it's a historical person, or if it's a fictional person, what would be that fictional person's characteristics, and then entering into it and then acting in accordance with it. So the idea on the two minds view is that that's what God did in Jesus of Nazareth. So by doing that, took on all the experiences, the belief system, etc., of a human being in first century Palestine. Now, that's not the only view. It'll work with any of the views, actually, of the incarnation that affirm the Athanasian doctrine, that Jesus was fully divine and fully human. Now, other views have hashed it out differently. Like there's one developed in the 19th century called kenosis, in which Jesus becomes God the Son, gives up the Son's divine attributes in the Trinity. So they think of the Trinity as three kind of centers of consciousness, united, perfectly united in will and sharing each other's contents of consciousness. And then one of those members gives up the divine attributes of omniscience and omnipotence while incarnates on earth. And that's what the incarnation's about. And another version is what's called the hypostatic view, is Jesus was actually a human person, but was fully united as you could be with the divine consciousness. So it doesn't really matter which of these views you take for the argument. It's just that there was a fully human, fully divine life in Jesus. Okay, so that first is a stage one for us to be able to participate in that life. It needs to be fully human, so otherwise we can't participate in it. It can't become part of our own consciousness. So it's a simple matter of logic. And what it does is it cashes out. A lot of religious traditions do affirm that as a supreme goal, right? This unity with God. But I think the problem is, given their shared conception of God, how is this unity even possible under their view? Because God's so transcendent from what we are. So it seems to me their views, if they wanted to think through what unity with God would be, without us just becoming God. I mean, some in Sufism, they were accused of heretics. Some actually went as far as would say things like, I am God, because God is so one that each, as an individual person, I'm just completely absorbed into God, but then you lose your individuality. So how to retain that and yet be united with God, where here you have to have something like the incarnation. So you get stage one of the incarnation. And then the second stage, what about the crucifixion? Well, if you have an incarnation, then what you would expect God to do is act in accordance with the highest human virtues. Now, you can cash them out any way you want, but I think a reasonable cashing them out would be the ones that Christianity has of faith, hope, and love. But so act in accordance with the highest human virtues. But if that's going to be helpful, redemptively helpful for us, in other words, sharing in those virtues is going to help us in this world and to be perfected, then you want those highest human virtues to be enacted in the toughest of life circumstances, where it's the toughest to enact them. And then that gets you to the crucifixion. So in the crucifixion, if you read about Roman system of crucifixion, crucifixion goes way back to the Babylonians, but the Romans perfected it to cause suffering, pain to the victim, and humiliation, because it was particularly reserved for those who rebelled. They considered rebels against the Roman Empire. And so it was like the pinnacle of methods of torture, and then to continue to act in faith, hope, and love, and act in accordance with God's will. Thy will be done, not mine. Take this cup from me, like in the Garden of Gethsemane, is to act in the highest of human virtues in the toughest of life situations. And so the idea is that's what you would expect a priori. Once you're a theist and you think that once you're a theist, so let me recap a piece of the argument here. Once you're a theist, you're going to think God is perfectly good. And if God is perfectly good, then God's going to want the optimized value, moral and aesthetic value in reality. God's going to act in such a way as to optimize that. And so unless you had some reason to think God acting to realize the greatest human good would undercut the ultimate, optimization of value in the universe, in reality, you would think, everything else being equal, that's what you would think God would do, to act to create the greatest good for us as embodied conscious beings. And so you would initially, it'd be quite plausible, expected. You would expect this unless you had a good reason to think it conflicted with some other, thing we don't know about, doing the greatest good for human beings would somehow undercut the good of something else. You would expect this greatest good. So I didn't put this as initially what I had imagined, but I imagine a context in which somebody becomes a theist, believes in God, knows all the basic facts about the world, that there's evil in the world, all the relevant facts, right? But has never heard the Christian story. And it's just thinking about this. So they just think about, well, what would God do in the world? What would be the greatest human good? What would be optimized value? And I think they would then say it would be becoming united with God. That would be the greatest human good, sharing in the divine life. And then once they thought that, well, how did that would occur? Well, they need an incarnation. And then how would that be maximally redemptively effective for us, for we could share in that? Well, you'd want that the God-man, so to speak, and whatever view you take of the incarnation here, to act out those virtues in the toughest of life situation. So you would expect something very similar to the Christian story, and you'd expect probably that person to do a teaching ministry, to say what God was really like and put us on the right path. And then the resurrection would be a vindication of that, which Paul says that's what, he was vindicated to be the Son of God. So then from all that, you really predict the very basic core of the Christian story, the idea of the incarnation, atonement. So this becomes now the atonement. So the idea now of atonement is once you get the cross, we are redeemed by being united with Christ in his life, death, and resurrection, just what Paul says. So Paul takes a participatory model of atonement. So how we get atoned is that we participate in this new life, and I've argued that elsewhere. It's all throughout the New Testament. The idea that it's via participation. Paul talks about if we die, we're united with Christ in his death, and then we're united with God in his resurrection. And other New Testament authors say the same thing, that the cross kind of directly sanctifies and transforms us. So then it's sharing in that divine life, and then to finally work that out more. So we begin the process here on earth. So it has ramifications for us here on earth, but then we continue that into the afterlife, and that becomes what happens is, I think of like Jesus becomes the template. He's the template for these new virtues, enacting these virtues. And then based on that template becomes real to us as we share in that. And then we enact them in particular life circumstances, like somebody might be a political prisoner and still forgive their torturers. That's different exactly than, maybe for several years. Jesus died on a cross, but wasn't a political prisoner for 10 years, right? So then, and then they forgive. So they are taking this kind of general inaction in the worst of life circumstance and particularizing it. And then those inactions, that new life, that virtuous life, is then God takes it up into God's own life. And then other people can now participate in those particularized actions. So then I tap into a biologist, Rupert Sheldrake, who has, I think, quite a bit of evidence for this thesis. That what he calls morphic fields, that there's these pattern forming fields, and that different like if you can resonate with them, and the more closer you are to the whatever initially enacted that field, close in terms of type, then that field will affect you more. So he gives like an example, he says is verified, of if rats in the United States learn a maze, then that same maze, rats in Australia will be faster at learning the maze because there's this kind of, they're participating in that pattern. So and then that pattern would explain how, cells differentiate, which is really hard to explain why they differentiate into the three-dimensional patterns they do from the zygote or, trees or whatever in biology. So in this way of thinking, Jesus instantiated a new morphic field, which everybody could participate in. And it's by participating in that new morphic field, we not only participated, but all of our good actions are then taken up into that morphic field. And because of its similarity, it allows me, like as a political prisoner, to, once somebody else has done it, it makes it easier for me to do it, enact those virtues. So you have the Christ is starting this. Now, is there scriptural evidence for this? Well, yeah, there is actually. In Colossians, Paul says, I'm completing the sufferings of Christ in my own body. So he's saying basically, I'm in my own way completing something that what Christ did on the cross. It's just like in Colossians, I think 1:24. Anyhow, so that's the basic idea. Then it has various, I guess, positive consequences. One of them, it makes sense now, of faith, why faith is a virtue, because, and why the early Christians, like in the 100 AD, were actually rational in their beliefs. So once you have belief in God and you think the world is ordered towards value, the good, then once you have that belief, then you would, and you think value is going to realize, then if you see something as a great story, so when they heard this, they resonated with it as this is a great story, right? Of liberation, of God becoming one of us, of us participating in this new life, being united with God. And so the greatness of the story, the goodness of the story attracted them to believe it. And that's a rational reason to believe something. I mean, actually, physicists were, they pursued theories based on their beauty. That's kind of well known. It was a very successful strategy in 20th century physics. So it's rational to believe something based on its goodness. And then that not only makes it rational, but it also makes faith in the response to goodness a virtue. Obviously, it's a virtue to respond to the perception of goodness and respond positively to it and not reject it. So you get passages like in the New Testament, he who wants to do the will of God will know that I'm from God. So if you want to do the good, you will be receptive to it. And so then it shows why faith is a virtue. And it also gives a way of hermeneutics of the Bible, because the original reason you believe, if it's on this, is because of the greatness of the story. So you do those interpretations of Scripture that are going to make God the greatest, would be morally the best. And then it gives you a starting point, from which you judge everything else, because that's the primary reason to believe. And then all the rest of the evidence, the apostolic witness and all that, I consider confirming evidence. So this is kind of the core piece, and that's the confirming evidence. So that's pretty much a rundown of the whole thing.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Collins. Let me ask you some questions now, because maybe someone would doubt on those claims. Why we even need incarnation to be united with God?
Well, if you cash out united with God, so we have to cash out, what does this mean to be united with God? And the idea is that be united with God is to actively share in the divine life. So God is so transcendent from us in God's self that there's no way we could do that unless God's self, God's life, became down to our level, and which would be a human life. That would make it maximize us being able to share in the divine life. I don't see any other way of really doing cashing out what it would mean. Like, okay, you have a more dynamic conception of God here, of the divine life, and that comports more in branches of Christianity with Eastern Orthodoxy. That Gregory of Nyssa had that conception of God being dynamic, and the whole Eastern Orthodox tradition itself is sharing in the divine energies or the divine life. That's what it means to be united with God, because they would claim God's essence is, you can't be united with God's essence, otherwise you'd be God. So the way we get united with God is his energies, which are thought of like the relation between the energies would be like the relation between the sun and its light and heat, right? They're closely united, but not the same. So the other one you get on the Western tradition is the idea of the beatific vision, a more static thing, like you get in Aquinas. And then you just simply somehow, and it's like never really explained how this is even possible. Somehow you have a vision of God, and you intellectually somehow your mind becomes united with God, but it's not even within the Western tradition. It doesn't even make any sense, because God is absolutely simple. So how can you be united with an absolutely simple being, which means absolute simplicity means God, there's no distinction between God's attributes. So God is just simply being itself. And how can you be meaningfully united with that beyond what we already are? I mean, we already participate in the being of God. And, I would agree with that. But there is a kind of, this idea goes beyond that, is participating in the very personhood of God. So personhood has intentionality, actions, beliefs, thoughts, all, and maybe they're the divine type, but they're a point of view, etc. So that's the idea why you need that. I don't think you now, if somebody could coherently make sense of what it would mean, then they would have an alternative to this. If they could say, well, being united with God, you don't need to share in the divine life, then okay, I'm all ears for that. But I don't understand what that means. And I don't understand what that means apart from just becoming God, which some people who thought along those lines, some of the mystics, said things along those lines. And I don't think that's possible.
Yes, all right. And why crucifixion is biggest virtue or highest, how you said. Skeptics could say or ask question, couldn't God just forgive sins to humans rather than to die on a cross or anything? So what
Yeah,
would
but
you
then God could forgive the humans, but then when we wouldn't be sharing in these new virtues of faith, hope, and love. So, and the problem is if Jesus just enacted them in the as a human life, then they wouldn't be virtues from the worst of human situations. They wouldn't be geared towards what we need, because we face all kinds of bad situations, and yet we're called to faith, hope, and love. Let's do them as the virtues. And so you need God to enact them first, so they're part of the divine, or the God man to enact them first, because then they're part of the divine life that we can share in. And so could God just give us the virtues? Yeah, God could just give it to, but it wouldn't create a unity with God. So remember, the idea is not just to act virtuously under this, it's to have a share in the life of God. It's participate in this new morphic field, and not only share in the life of God, but we're sharing now because all these different individuals are sharing in the life of God. It creates a body, because all what the cells do in a body is share in the life of the body. So we're all now participating in the life of each other. So there's this unity coming about between not only us and God, but us and each other, all participating ultimately in that life, where if God just gives us the virtues, there's neither unity with God occurring because of that, nor unity with each other. And that's not as a good situation. So it's not a matter of God forgiving us our sins. That would be a more penal substitution idea. If you think that's necessary, that God somehow has to pay, I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's actually taught in the New Testament. But if you think it is, and God has to pay some penalty, you can just add that to this theory. Oh, then there's another reason God has to pay the penalty. But my theory, the idea here doesn't require that. It's all about having a new life, and that life being that God, the God human enacted, being completely virtuous, and virtuous in a way that comes from an experience of the deepest, most tempting life situations, the toughest ones to enact them, experiencing those situations. So Jesus experienced like even alienation from God, according to the New Testament, because he says on the cross, why, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? So he's going in the depths of human experience and yet enacting these virtues. So it's not a matter of God just forgiving our sins. It's a matter of sharing in this new life of God. I mean, if you want to think that the forgiveness, this other idea of forgiveness, so I think forgiveness actually in the New Testament, in original Greek, if you look up like Strong's Concordance, it has a major meaning of being released from. So I think forgiveness being released from sin, that means the the penalty of sin is the built-in consequences, which is alienation from God and each other, and the very things that make are valuable. So it's kind of like in C.S. Lewis, in The Great Divorce, in that twilight zone, you just go further into it, in the outer darkness, if you don't somehow get redeemed from those sins. So you suffer the natural consequences, alienation from God and each other.
Awesome, thank you so much. And if we have religions whose followers include many wise people who invented various things in science and had many advanced ethics, such as Greeks, etc., among others, Christianity is relatively new, emerged only 2000 years ago. So how can it then be the true religion?
Okay, so why would it wait for this long? If the first question is, why didn't God do the incarnation earlier? Okay, and so wouldn't it benefited more people to do it earlier? Well, I think this was the time in which, if there was a teaching part of it, that the Christian message could spread. First of all, the Roman Empire, that was the Peace of Rome, where they built Pax Romana, where they built all the roads and stuff. And so you could actually travel around. Before, you just get, people would basically kill you and take your stuff. So there wasn't the kind of protection you would get. And so it allowed the message to spread. It was really the first time that happened. And it was a time where kind of the brutality was perfected, which allowed the God-man to enter into the depths of the human, the toughest of life situations. So that's the first part, being the now true religion. Now I wouldn't say, so I want to make, when you say true religion, it's not like all pieces of the other religions are false. I mean, insofar as they are not contradict the core of the Christian message, the sharing in the life of God and incarnation and things like that, they might very well be aspects of them are true. So people, I believe in a kind of progressive revelation that God, and still is ongoing. So God works in the world through, it's a kind of incarnational way of working in the world through human culture. And so it was through human culture, and there was kind of a revelation going on, and that revelation develops. So even if you look in Buddhism, the developing, which usually is thought of as atheistic religion, though it develops close to theism, in much the later Mahayana, what's called the Mahayana tradition, the Buddha nature, which is the cosmic nature, which we are to participate in ultimately, manifests itself personally in terms of bodhisattvas. And then there is where the Buddhists in the later, like a Pure Land or other sorts of traditions that really stress the bodhisattva, they say we can't reach that by our own power because that's contradictory. That's reinforcing the ego, which the Buddhists are against, but it has to be other power. So suddenly they're getting something very close to the kind of Christian message, the other power of the bodhisattva, which is kind of like, which is what Christianity is saying about Jesus and Christ. They just haven't got there all the way. So it's not to say that the other world religions are false. They were grasping towards a lot of true things. And insofar as they believe some kind of unity with God is a supreme human good, and there's an ultimate oneness of reality, they're on the right track. So now I only assert that the argument only requires you assert that this core message is true, and the incarnation, and not that, and this crucifixion and sharing in this divine life, not that all the other religions in all ways are false. I mean, and there might be false things that in later Christian doctrine, I mean, it doesn't say anything about that. It doesn't guarantee, and there surely are, because the later, Christianity had all kinds of different forms that contradict each other. There's just one version of Christianity. There's like big ones, Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism, and Protestantism. And as we all know, they don't all agree. And then there's the more minor ones, like Ethiopian Church, the Coptics, and all this sort of thing. So that would be the approach here to other world religions. In our narrative version, the greatest story, we kind of address that as also as part of this greatest story, this narrative, which might at a point have conflicting elements, but part of what makes a great narrative is all the conflicting elements get reconciled. And so you have that message in Colossians, is that through Christ, all things will be reconciliation of all things. So I think that's ultimately even of the other major world religions. In fact, they could be right in certain areas that goes beyond this core argument. Some of the widely held Christian beliefs are actually wrong. I mean, I think people that believe in, like, if you don't hear the message of Jesus and, you die, you're going to eternal punishment in hell, I think that's just horrible doctrine. And a lot, like in theistic versions of Hinduism, tend to be universalistic. So I think they're more right on that than standard Christian doctrine. So so you have to take the core of, so I think a Christian needs to affirm the core of Christianity is true, and anything that conflicts with that is false, or at least partially false. Um, but beyond that, there's a lot of other doctrine and other claims that you just have to look at a case-by-case basis, and whether you take them literally or metaphorically or how you actually take them is going to be a bunch of questions that are going to arise there.
I appreciate your answer, Professor Collins. And how would you respond to someone who says all religions are equally valid paths to God? Because there is much similarity, as you pointed out. But what's unique about Christian ethical framework? So, can you expand those topics?
Well, I think because if you once you believe in the incarnation, then and that Jesus was incarnate, that's going to give a certain pride of place to the teachings of Jesus. And the teachings of, Jesus is that the social message to care for the least of these, that's going to be the kind of those central parts, and the stress on love as the ultimate virtue are going to be there, and the way of not of kind of non-violence is not by violent means that the God's purposes are achieved by but instead by absorbing the violence, so to speak, on the cross. So a lot of things like that, like love your enemies, forgive, keep forgiving people that persecute you. So all those kind of ethical teachings you find of Jesus in the New Testament are going to get a pride of place. Now, I should say a lot of the other world religions, there's at least significant pieces of them they don't disagree with. Even Muslims, they highly admire Jesus. They just don't think he was crucified. And, he kind of, some people have said he's the soul of Islam in terms of, because he's considered a great prophet. It's just that they think the New Testament is distorted on what he actually said. You have then Buddhism, the stress on love. One of the characteristics of the Bodhisattva is love for all beings. You get that in Chinese philosophy, in the Neo-Confucian tradition, when it kind of fully develops, that love for all creatures. So there's a deep compatibility there. But where there's a conflict with the teachings of Jesus, then I would have to say you'd go with the teachings of Jesus. But there's a lot of places they actually don't conflict. Now, I think that in the Hinduism, in those systems, when you have reincarnation, does run into the problem of caring for the least of these. And I think part of the problem there is that this belief that the people are basically suffering, etc., because of previous sins inhibits that, because you think they're just getting what they deserve. Why they're burning off their bad karma. But I think the way the reincarnation system works in the East, in Hinduism, is actually almost self-contradictory, because we've been in this cycle of reincarnation an infinite amount of time. We're eternal. The souls are eternal. And then if that's true, I think you have zero hope of ever getting out. If I haven't got out by now, if I failed the exam the last infinite number of times, I don't think I'm going to pass it the next time. And so I think the whole system's really problematic. I don't have a problem with limited reincarnation. I'm not sure that's even opposed to Christianity, but the kind of systems in the East, I do. And I think on their own grounds, they're a problem. So, and that's a lot of the ethical teaching of not caring for the least of these is within that culture has come out of that. Now, on the other hand, in Buddhism and Hinduism, and the idea of ahisma, nonviolence, is a central core of part of their ethical teaching, and that comports nicely with Christianity. And even like, and so the Jewish ethical system in many ways is very similar, but I don't think I think where they differ is on the forgiveness, of the obligation to forgive everybody. So that's how I'd kind of answer to that kind of question. I agree with C.S. Lewis and Evelyn Underhill. She was a great, a classic text on mysticism, and they both said that C.S. Lewis had thought of it as these other myths, and he could extend to world religions. He was more interested in mythology. They dimly grasped what was made historical and real in Jesus Christ. So he was like referring to the dying God and the Egyptian myths of dying and rising God. And, there was an objection that Christians kind of stole that. And he said, no, rather the opposite is that if Christianity is true, you would expect these truths to be grasped in mythological form by other people who are not Christians, and even in previous societies, like you were talking about the Greeks and things like that. So you would expect that, and so finding that is actually in accordance with Christianity. And then Evelyn Underhill said that the Christian, but the strength of Christianity is it sheds light on all these other religions, what you in ignorance worship, she quotes Paul, or what you dimly grasp, it articulates.
Yes, I honestly thought like that years ago, because when I think about Trinity, we have tritheism or some forms of that in pagan cultures before Christianity.
Mhm.
But if Christianity is true, then we would expect something to see even before Christianity,
Right.
some thoughts about that. So do you agree with
And
that?
then also what you understand the Trinity to be. I mean, there's one extreme is a social conception, is just three centers of consciousness. And then the other extreme kind of more collapses the three together. And there's no standard, there's a formulation, one three persons in simple formulation, three persons in one substance. But exactly what does that mean? So it doesn't deny the oneness of God. And I take it the ultimate significance is just that there's interrelationality in God, even though we might not understand what that is. And then there's the idea that there's the economic conception of the Trinity. And I think that even occurs, and you have a major Iranian figure, a theologian, Muslim theologian, and there's not many really Muslim theologians because they're mostly stressed on the law. But he was one of them, an Iranian Nasser. And according to, there is a kind of economic trinity that there's the idea that there's the being, the source of all being, which would be the Father, and in Christianity. And then there's the Word, which is the kind of structural concepts part of God, the divine ideas. And then there's activity of God in the world, and that's the Holy Spirit. So at least that economic part of the Trinity is not only found there, but it's like found in, Plato too. And then the Father is the source of all being. So that's one way that what Christians did in their Orthodox formulations of it is take that economic Trinity and make it more than just economic, but somehow part of an interrelationality within the divine. So some of I think the opposition to Trinity, like in Islam and things like that, is more of a misunderstanding of it. When you say God the Father and God the Son, it's easy to misunderstand that literally, and that God the Father had sex with Mary and had a son, right? And it's not what it's meaning. So it's very subject to misunderstanding. So then you would have to see how much the core of their religion, their religious insight, actually differed from the best version is there a version of the Trinity that remains true to Christianity that would, where it could intersect their claims? And if there is, then they're not in conflict. They're only in conflict with some versions, not others.
Okay, thank you. Here is a tough one question. Michael Licona would say if Jesus rose from the dead, that's a game, set, match. Christianity is true. But what if we found a person who thought that we should be united with God, who perhaps even was crucified, or maybe he has some followers who claim that this person rose from the dead? Does that then make that person's religion true? In other words, why does resurrection make religion true?
I don't agree. I don't agree it makes it true. I think you have to have a higher probability. So it's a matter of you already expect something like this based on just theism. You expect something like the Christian story, and then you find it, and you find this confirming evidence of the resurrection as kind of a stamp, God's stamp of approval. Now, if you just had let's suppose I didn't have all these other reasons for believing in this, and I just had the resurrection. Well, maybe people have, there's some psychic power. I mean, there's a lot of New Age, what goes under the name of New Age beliefs that could give you a resurrection. Hinduism, there's avatars that could be they could demonstrate their power. I don't think and then, so I don't think it directly gives you the Christian message. And, a Hindu would understand, they would say, oh, that was an avatar for our culture, right? So, of course, they said there's the Son of God because they really were the Son of God, because all the avatars are manifestations of God, as everybody is. And so I don't think it's going to give you in any straightforward way Christianity. And it also, you could have psychic powers, or you could have, aliens. They have, Star Trek kind of scenarios, beings, that have the power to do that, or we've developed the technology to do that. Or, that, so there's so many other explanations that you just have a really hard time excluding. And then you say, well, they're not probable. But on the other hand, it's also, if you don't have an a priori reasons ahead of time to believe that God would do something like this, it's not very probable that somebody, God would raise somebody from the dead either. You'd have no reason to believe that. Um, and then, it would be an incredible story to tell, apart from this other stuff, that God became incarnate. It seems like it initially gets you into contradictions unless you understand it. So I just don't see that you can rest it all on the incarnation, resurrection. When I first was looking into this years and years ago, I read like William Lane Craig's book on it, and but then it looked quite convincing to me just on the resurrection. But then as I read other people who have like a hallucination hypothesis, like let's say Bart Ehrman, where it's over time it gets developed, right? So, because we don't even know on the Gospels, people just claim they were written much later, and they certainly were. Everybody agrees they were written quite a bit later. So we only have Paul's testimony. But why couldn't there just have been somebody who claimed a resurrection and then, are seeing Jesus, and then other people started claiming the same thing, and then that spread. And particularly all the conspiracy theories that have, I mean, the United States, there's all these people with conspiracy theories, all the junk they believe in my view. QAnon was one of the big ones. And it kind of spreads these ideas, and people believe all kinds of things that seem completely against the evidence we have. I see that kind of belief spreading all the time, that against evidence before your eyes. So when they say like, well, they could have just pulled out the body of Jesus. Well, people do that. They could have just looked into the evidence about QAnon, and you'd find it immediately it's false, but people don't listen. All of this stuff, you could just look it up, and people still hold on to their beliefs. So I just don't see that as being and who's going to be pulling out the body, and how do you know, that you don't even know how strong the belief was the Jewish authorities would even be motivated to do that. I mean, it was kind of against Jewish custom. You don't go pulling out the body of a dead person. So, I mean, it just seems to me those arguments, they at best are confirmatory arguments. I don't deny they have some force. There seems to be something unusual about the apostolic witness. It doesn't seem very likely to me, apart from a true resurrection, but the level of confirmation is not nearly enough to overcome the prior improbability of something like this happening apart from some kind of argument like I gave. So you really need that. You need the other part of it. If you don't have it, I don't think it's strong enough.
Okay, thank you. And what is your comment on the miracles? Because we have many accounts that Jesus appears all over the world to some people. Maybe that's lie, maybe that's hallucination and other things, but maybe there are real appearances.
Yeah,
So,
I don't have any objection to miracles. I don't think there's any scientific case against them. And I think Hume's argument is bogus from a Bayesian perspective, as John Ehrman has argued. So I don't think there's any. I think you'd actually expect miracles if there is a God, to a kind that was actually working in the world. Um, I don't think there's even I don't even think of miracles interventions in the laws of nature, because God upholds the laws. So God just doesn't uphold the laws in the same way when there's a miracle occurring. And some of them might even be compatible with the laws, or just unusual occurrences. So I have no problems with the miracles, and I have no problems with the miracles of Jesus. Now, some people claim that some of them maybe they're mythological because they're trying to, it's for a literary device. Well, maybe that's true. But I have no problems with the miracle of Jesus. Now, there is one that always strikes me as being sort of evidential for the miracles. And it occurs unusually in the New Testament. It's like, it looks puzzling. And it's the one where Jesus heals the blind man's eyes. And this train's going by. So Jesus is healing the blind man's eyes. So he put mud in their eyes and spit and mud. And the person he says, "Can you see?" And the person says, "No, I can't see. I can see, but everything looks like people look like trees, or like shadows moving around." And then Jesus lays hands on him again. And then, so it does a second thing. It looks kind of odd. Why couldn't he do it right the first time? And that's what Nisha's objection does it a second time, and then the person can see. Well, we know now from modern science that, people that were, when people were blind because of their eyes, something wrong with their eyes, and they fixed that like a cover over, internally, and they surgically fixed it. The people could see only in the sense that things look all indistinct and moving around, because sight requires both the eyes and the brain processing it. And it's difficult as an adult for that brain has to rewire itself so it could process that visual stimuli to make it into people and other distinct figures. Otherwise, it's just a kind of mess. And in fact, a lot of those people then, once they were, surgically removed, they went back to putting a blindfold over them because they never could adapt. It was just too confusing to them. So from a modern perspective, it actually suddenly makes a lot of sense. Well, yeah, Jesus would have to do two things, with the mud, fix the eyes, and then second, fix the brain. And so interestingly, that's the only time he does a two-step process in the miracle, and the only time it seems to need a two-step process. So to me, that lends quite a bit of credibility to at least a lot of the miracle accounts, not maybe all of them. I can't say, but my whole argument's not dependent on those. But it seems to me also, if you just look the kind of miracles that were done were always had a purpose. And you look at mythological stories of miracles, like in the apocryphal gospels, Jesus takes clay birds and makes them fly. They're like, or curses something, I guess there is the case of cursing the tree, but they're all for a point in the New Testament. They're not just these fantastical things. And people weren't, when they wrote up stories in the past, they weren't, seemed like they didn't care too much, like in the Apocryphal Gospels, them being very, close to reality. I guess, learning about people and these conspiracy theories and stuff, a lot of people, I don't think, don't care if they're close to reality. The more fantastical, the better, right? So that it has a ring of truth. The miracles have a ring of authenticity. They're unlike a lot of the other stories. Now, that is not to say some of them might not be there, as some have argued, for as a literary device to illustrate some point. I don't feel I have to take a literal view of it all, but um, I have no problem with it.
All right, I'm impressed with your answers and explanation. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Yes, so I have a last question for you. Why is it not enough to just believe in a God? Why must we ask which God?
Well, I mean, I do think that believing in God, so in my view, the new morphic field, you can participate in the life without actually explicitly knowing about Christianity. So I don't think it's necessary for um, salvation. There's a passage in the New Testament actually. I remember the exact quotation, but it's in John about there are many you know nothing of. So I don't think there's any good case to make of a kind of restrictivist view that you have to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ and accept it to be saved. So I think a lot of people that they're following the life they have, they're maybe sensing the divine and a possibility of sharing in that life can do so. I just think in general it helps to know. Like to be a Christian, then it says, well, the teachings of Jesus are truly the way to go. Even though there's a huge problem today of a lot of people, how they interpret those teachings, or they just ignore them, like the social teachings of helping the least of these, like with immigrants and things like that. My view, they just ignore. They're just ignoring what Jesus explicitly says. And so I think if you really take Jesus seriously, it does really, help you ethically live a life ethically on the right track. But you could believe in, you could claim to believe as Christians and, do all kinds of things that really are against Jesus. So I guess my view is it's true, the incarnation, but that you have to believe it's true is not required. You can participate without that, but it's generally helpful to believe that. Everything else being equal, it's helpful to believe that. So and especially helpful for those who are in more polytheistic religions but in the other monotheistic traditions, they already have a lot of things they already have a lot of it's already in place. So I guess that's my view of it. So I think I'm an exclusivist in the sense that I think that insofar as other world religions deny the life, death, and resurrection and the incarnation and atonement, they're wrong in those areas. Um, but I don't claim that I don't claim following the light they have in the other religions, like there being one God and stuff. There's a sense in which that's going to be a way. It's only a partial way, though. As we all only have partial ways. And the reason that way works is ultimately because of the Christian story. So it's that's how it answered the other way objection. So I don't think all the people in other world religions, especially before Christianity even came along, they're just all going to hell. That doesn't make any sense to me. It is completely contrary to my view of the love of God and I think the teachings of the New Testament.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much, Professor Collins. And for conclusion, have you anything to add? For example, if Bart Ehrman were to watch this video, what would you say to him and the people who follow him and his views about Christianity? He obviously say it's wrong. So, what message would you send? Where is he wrong?
Well, I think, I've listened and I actually for a while listened to quite a bit of Bart Ehrman because once I've come up with this argument, I've been trying to listen to the atheists and the people rejecting Christianity. I'll say a couple things, not just Bart Ehrman, but others that reject Christianity you see in debates it's a lot of it is the ethical teachings or the inerrancy teachings that they condone, the seeming genocide in the Old Testament. And that's really problematic because some of the genocide, you have in like the book of Joshua, the Amalekites, according to the book of Joshua, God tells the Amalekites to kill the Amalekites because of what they did 400 years earlier, opposing Israel. It's like a grudge. It's not because of how evil they are right now. And so it seems like it's a very bad moral reason, immoral act. And I just think the best solution to that is just to say, no, we don't have to, there was a progressive revelation, is that people's ideas of God developed. And I mean, this is even, the Jews who take the Hebrew Bible, they have a whole, if you want to go that route and take, follow the Hebrew Bible instead of looking at it as I would do through the lens of Christ and what you're going to take as true or helpful or not, then go with the Jews. And the Jews have this whole tradition of, Midrash and Talmud, in which they do all the symbolic interpretation and everything, and they take that as inspired. So if you want to do it, follow the Jews, and you're not going to get into at least a lot of them, you're not going to get into this problem because they're much more expansive allowance of interpretation. So I think that's one of the things that get into a lot of problem. And I think it's completely unnecessary to take that view of scripture. And I think what motivates a lot of that is that you think if you don't have inerrancy, all Christianity troubles. It's as though inerrancy is the reason you're believing in Christ and the gospel is because you believe the Bible's inerrant. I think you got it just backwards. The reason you believe is for reasons like I articulated, the greatness of the message. And then whatever you believe about the status of the Bible, the status of tradition, all that is whatever is implied by that. The truth of those core claims, like the truth of the core claim that of the incarnation and the atonement participatory model. And so, you then whatever you think is made probable by that, that you'd probably think, well, a lot of what church tradition held to was likely to be true. Maybe not all of it was. And you might have, it makes it more likely that, the a lot of the Old Test, what we call the Old Testament is, there's at least a lot of insight in there, but progressive revelation is certainly compatible with that God, God used, there was a revelation occurring. Maybe that's why God picked where the incarnation was going to occur is because of this whole theistic tradition developing in Israel. But it doesn't give you inerrancy or anything like that. So that's on the one side. And then Bart Ehrman, so I think part of what happened is he was, conservative evangelical, or he was an evangelical before. Then he, lost his faith. And he had believed, he would defended this kind of inerrancy of the Bible. And I still suspect some of that, the idea of the reliability of scripture was his main basis for belief in that. And he didn't switch to another basis. So that got undermined. And he also, what I've heard of him is he can't make sense of the standard view of atonement, and he doesn't seem aware of the other possibilities very much. So the penal substitution, he can't make sense of that. Well, I can't either. I don't think it makes much sense, but I don't adopt that view. I think it's not even Paul's view. So, and then he has a belief in God and the problem of evil, but I don't think he's very aware of the fine-tuning argument material. And I think there's solutions to the problem of evil. And so I think he's kind of weak on all that stuff. So it'd be nice at some point to talk to him in person and
Yes,
see
thank
what
you
he
so
would, how he would object to this argument.
Thank you, Dr. Collins, for joining us again and for helping us think more deeply about the rational case for Christianity. To our viewers, if you found this episode valuable, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with friends who are exploring these questions. Let us know in the comments what convinces you or doesn't about the case for Christianity. Until next time, thanks for watching and greetings from Serbia.